my name is Jeannie Vanasco, and welcome to Fall for the Book. These free online events run through November, and you can find the full schedule at fallforthebook.org. And if you want to follow the festival on Crowdcast, you can do that by clicking the Fall for the Book icon above this window and then clicking follow. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our 4 panelists for a discussion on writing trauma. As the event goes on, please, if a question comes to you, feel free to type it in the chat. And when we get to that portion of the event, I'll pull audience questions for our panelists. So I'm going to start with Grace Talusan. She's here to talk about her memoir, The Body Papers, which is a New York Times Editor's Choice selection, a must-read for the Massachusetts Book Awards, and winner of the Restless Books Prize for New Immigrant Writing. The Boston Globe says of it, "The book is visceral, bodily, and throbs with pain and trauma, sexual abuse by a family member, cancer, the phantom limb ache of an outsider in a foreign land, and later as an outsider in the homeland." Grace is the Fannie Hurst Writer-in-Residence at Brandeis University. Next, we have Alicia Sasha. She's here to talk about her essay collection, A Fish Growing Lungs, which Kirkus calls a potent cautionary tale about the dangers of psychiatric misdiagnoses and the stigma of mental illness. Publishers Weekly praises it as a refreshingly open-ended collection that provides a model of how essay writing can be used for self-exploration. Alicia is a features editor for The Rumpus and lives in Northern Virginia. Next, we have Sonia Solter, who's here to discuss her debut middle grade book, When You Know What I Know. School Library Journal describes this novel in verse as, quote, a difficult but important read, giving a voice to sexual abuse survivors and helping others see the complexity of emotions and the hard work that goes into the healing process. And Kirkus says, this offering of hope after trauma is importantly unromanticized. Sonia is a creative writing mentor with the Society of Young Inklings and lives in Colorado. And next we have Nikki Grimes, who's here to talk about her memoir in verse, Ordinary Hazards. Booklist in a starred review calls it a powerful and inspiring collection of poems. Kirkus praises it as, quote, an intimate look at the forces that shaped her as an artist and as a person determined to find the light in the darkest of circumstances. A prolific and best-selling author, Nikki has received many awards for her contributions to children's and adolescent literature. She lives in California. Thank you all so much for being here. I feel so grateful to have encountered your work and spent time with it. And so I'm just gonna jump in and I'm excited to have the conversation. All right, so this is kind of a general question, applies to everyone. When did you know you wanted to write your recent books, and when did you feel ready to do so? Nikki, I'd like to start with you, if that's okay.
Well, I've always believed that the most important story I have to tell is my own, and Ordinary Hazards is that story. In terms of being ready, I don't think anybody is ever really ready or ever feels ready, but I knew I was running out of time. And I first started working on it 39 years ago. So I'd call that the longest gestation period in the history of the world. But over time, I work on it, set it aside, work on it, set it aside, and the structure evolved from, let's see, stories to personal essays to poetry. And then I finally landed on the structure that I have now.
That's great, thank you. And Sonia?
Yeah, so I felt like it came to me very spontaneously, but I don't think that's really true. For my subconscious, I was sitting out in the woods and one of the first poems in the book came to me. While it's not autobiographical, I do think that some of my own healing had to have happened before I started writing this. And interestingly, the genre also comes into it for me because I had just had a picture book semester in the MFA program that I was doing. And I feel like that sort of was able to be this tool that was able to give voice to my character.
That's great. And Grace?
So I've been, like Nikki, I've been writing for a long time. And I think that I tried to approach the material in fiction and in essay and in other ways. And then a couple of years ago, I was sitting with a friend and she said that I had probably enough material for a book. And I just hadn't really considered having this be at the center of a book, like this experience that I had gone through, or the trauma that I had gone through, had been sort of like putting it on the side. So I think a couple of years ago, and I think I felt ready because I had to do a lot of like personal work and healing and addressing some of the psychological issues before I could actually write the material, but also put it out in the world.
And Alicia?
Like Sonia, I conceived of my project in an MFA program. And I think for me, the conceiving of it and the starting of it happened like pretty simultaneously, in that I knew I needed to write a book to finish my MFA program. And I've told the story a lot, but I like it. I like had this idea like, oh, you know, maybe I could write a book about my misdiagnosis. And very shortly thereafter, I like barged into my thesis advisor's office. And I was like, hey, this happened to me. Do you think this would be a good book? And his response was, maybe, but you have to write it to really like find out the answer to that. And that really wasn't the answer I wanted, but that's what happened.
That's great. And I love how all of your answers actually, like thinking about how long a book takes. I think that's something that writers are often asked, and it's so hard to put a finite amount of time. Where I know when I've said that, you know, my first book was more than 10 years and students were like, wow, that's a long time. And I get very defensive, like, well, I wasn't working on it every day for 10 years, but it is something, right? So then the second book I tried to write very quickly, I think out of an insecurity. But I think it's something like you all touched on, like where you have, I don't know, if inspiration, or you have an experience, or you have that triggering event or image or whatever, and so much of the writing process is just thinking, I would say, you know, and sitting and reflecting. Okay, so I want to get into a question, because this is a panel called Writing Trauma. I feel like I have to ask some questions tied to trauma. So trauma rarely fits neatly into the received structures or forms that general readers expect. For example, sometimes closure just doesn't exist, at least not in the ways that people conceptualize closure. Can you talk about how trauma informed your book's structures or genres? Related to this, were there any writing rules or advice that you found yourself resisting in order to write these stories? I'll start with Alicia.
Yeah, so before I got my MFA, I was in a master's program for rhetoric and composition, and my thesis work was specifically on like service learning projects with mental health organizations. So I spent a couple of years before doing my own creative work sort of reading about illness narratives, disability studies, all that good stuff. So I had a fair amount of like theory going into my own project, and I knew I did not want it to be a chronological memoir for a number of reasons. Some were like, you know, based on my principles, but some were just like kind of practical in that my memory of large swaths of my life is like pretty choppy, and the amount of invention I would have needed to do to craft a cohesive narrative with like your rising and falling action was just not something that I was willing to really do. I think the essay in my book that plays the most with form is probably the Withdrawal Essay, and I needed to capture like, you know, a very large span of time and essentially like 10 pages. And so the form allowed me to do that in ways that I think like a traditional chronology would not have, in a way that made sense. But I know that like Grace, for example, you have a chronological memoir. So I'm doing the thing where I'm like, making it a conversation, but I was wondering if you could talk about your process, just because you did write a memoir, whereas I was very like in my I don't want to camp.
Sure. Well, I mean, actually, my book in some ways is, especially when I'm writing about trauma, I think there's ways that the story shifts out of chronology and is kind of fragmented. And I think that probably mirrors my maybe my coping mechanisms or something. I don't actually know enough about the theories of trauma and writing, but I tried to write some of the material in like the so-called right way, because I had thought like, oh, this is the right way. You do this thing. It has to be cohesive. It has to have a singular narrator, and you go forward in time. But then when the work would actually come out, the things that felt most alive and honest and true was writing that actually jumped all over the place and was more like my experience of life, which is things, I mean, I'll be living my life and things will come to me and I'll remember them. And I mean, I'll feel like I'm there when it was 30 years ago or 20 years ago. And I mean, I've even had experiences where like I'll be in the same places that I was many years ago. Like I worked for a while at the college that I went to after a long absence. And I remember like walking out and being really tired from work and thinking like, wait, where am I? Like, am I 19 like my friend's gonna come down the sidewalk and I'm gonna have dinner with them, or is this when I'm in my 30s and like have to go home from work now? It's just like sometimes I experience time in these out of chronological sequence, and so some of the writing most directly about trauma, I think, reflects that experience I've had. But thanks for asking.
And well, I had the same issues with memory. I had a lot of memory loss. In fact, I didn't have the experience of having to suffer through the traumas because, you know, I've gone through the healing process in all this time. But what was difficult for me and what I grieved were the blank spots. There were so many, you know, places in my memory that were lost and were hard to deal with. And so that whole issue of trying to figure out some sort of chronology, you know, made me a little crazy. But the two structural things that resulted from that were the series of poems about memory, because I really wanted to sort of dig into that since that was an issue for me, and the inclusion of notebook entries, which I created in part to navigate the memory blank spaces. So those were the two things that really concretely came out of that struggle to deal with. Yeah, I found memory loss is a trauma all its own. So yeah.
So for me, the freedom of the free verse form it just allowed me to it's written in first person, and it just really allowed me to get into my main character, Tori's voice and her thoughts. And with the trauma, I felt like there were some disjointed thoughts, there were shifting and surging emotions, and the freedom of the form just really helped me so much to be able to express that in the way that I wanted to, and to make it feel realistic. So to me, it felt more realistic than it would have felt in a very straight prose kind of form. In terms of something that I did that isn't as typical, I started the book very deliberately. So it's right in the aftermath of the trauma. It starts with when she first tells her mother, who at first does not believe her. And that was deliberate, not having sort of a more introductory kind of part where you get to know the character and then something happens, right? So I did that on purpose, partly because I wanted it to be very focused on the aftermath and healing journey. But it was also because for this particular story, it just felt right to me that the reader was right there knowing what was happening right from the beginning. So
That's
that was
great. And I realize actually for any viewers who haven't yet read your books, and I want everyone to read your books, could you, just to ground it, each of you kind of explain what I hate this as a writer, like what the book is about. I hate the elevator pitch, but just so they have a sense of what you're referring to. So Sonia, could you explain to everyone what the trauma is at the center of your novel?
Yes. So the main character is Tori, who's 10 years old, and she has just had one incident where she was sexually abused by her uncle. And so the book is the aftermath of that, showing the complexity in all kinds of ways for her, including with her lots of her key relationships, and then also sort of the slow progress towards healing.
Thanks. And Nikki, would you mind sort of grounding viewers in?
Yeah, this is hard to distill, but it's following the first 16 years of my life, which incorporates living with someone with mental illness and who's an alcoholic, being in and out of foster care, and nightmares that resulted from that, and also the trauma of sexual abuse by a stepfather. And the real kind of core of it is how all of those things informed and created me as a writer and helped me to discover the power. I don't know if that's the right way to say, but I discovered in the midst of that the power of the written word, and reading and writing became my survival tools as a result.
Thank you. And Grace, just to ground.
Yeah, so the Body Papers is about a lot of things. And one of the, I mean, if I look at it mostly about trauma, there's many different sorts of trauma that happen, including immigration for me as a young child. And, but the central trauma in terms of like how much time it lasted was the sexual abuse by my grandfather for 7 years when I was a child, almost every night. And so even though the book isn't, the book's about a lot of different things, that is a couple of chapters about what that meant to me, and how I've made meaning out of it, or what I've thought, like stories about how I've processed that.
Great. And Alicia?
Yeah, so it's funny, this is actually the second panel I've been on in the past year or so about writing trauma. And I guess like when I thought about like me writing my book, like I did not think I was writing a trauma narrative. And so I think that's really interesting. But so A Fish Growing Lungs is my book. But the narrator is diagnosed with bipolar disorder in a psych ward when she's 18. I'm the narrator, but you know, I just want to clarify. And then when she's 25, she learns that she's been misdiagnosed. So the book sort of like takes apart the question that underlies that, which is like, how does something like that happen? So how does someone get that seriously misdiagnosed, and like, what is the process of finding out you're misdiagnosed like? And it looks at that question and tries to answer that question through a number of like discrete chapters that are all sort of thematic in their own sort of way. So like one's about like eating issues, and other one's about like hiking and doing cocaine. So yeah.
That's great, thank you. No, and I know I sort of hate that, or recoil at the question, because in a lot of ways, if it were easy to summarize, you wouldn't have written the book, right? Yeah. So I'm sorry for putting you through that. I'm curious again, like, because we're in this panel and it's writing trauma, so another trauma-based question, but it grounded on craft, is I was thinking about how each of your books engage with this idea of silence. And silence often accompanies stories of trauma. And, you know, sometimes a survivor or victim of trauma feels pressured to keep silent about what happened to them. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how this connects, and then the strategies that you as writers found yourselves using to convey that, to convey the ways in which either, you know, you have a character not talking about what happened, or yeah, I'll leave it to you. And I'd like to start with those of you writing in verse, just because I feel like poetry offers this really interesting way into thinking about silences and making silence present. So Sonia and then Nikki.
Yeah, so Tori, who's the main character, has a couple different things going on, different aspects of silence, I would say, because so she has sort of the aspect of not having been believed when her voice, was first let out. And then, but she also doesn't want people to know. And so she's also not wanting to tell people. So she has that kind of an interior silence going on. And then sort of layered onto that is the fact that she's having some dissociation. So there's sort of this sense of a feeling of silence when she feels apart from things going on around her, which sometimes, I guess I mainly depicted that almost as like a kind of a buzz sound in her head. So that's kind of interesting because it's in a way conveying a sense of silence, but with a sound for her internally. But I would say the main techniques I used, there were actually a lot of available techniques. Again, that's partly why I like the form so much, but just purely physical action was a lot of it. So she goes, under the covers a lot, stuffs her face in her pillow. Let's see. She chews her lip instead of when she doesn't tell her best friend, she's chewing her lip instead when they're at lunch. And then a lot of metaphor. So for example, when she does tell her best friend eventually, she has this sense of, it's like a boa constrictor unwinded from around her throat and she can breathe again and get air. And then some other techniques, I guess, are just as simple as, word choice and sound. Like I use the word stuffed with a hush, for example, so that has kind of a sha kind of sound to it. And then I also noticed that contrast is actually kind of big as well. So she feels like when she's in music class that the instruments are really, really loud. So she's being more quiet, but everything's feeling much louder to her. And then that's also contrasted because she does have an outburst. So there's then this big outburst, all in capitals, and then she retreats back again to her silence. So those are just some of the techniques, but there's a lot available, which was wonderful when I was writing because it was very helpful.
That's great. And Nikki?
Well, silence. I felt it wasn't really safe. I didn't have anybody safe to share anything with. I also had a situation where I already knew that the adults didn't believe when children said things. My sister would tell my mother things and she would be called a liar for it. So I knew, okay, it's not safe for me to tell because I'm not going to be heard or I'm not going to be believed. And in life, as in the book, the way I dealt with that was to tell everything on the page. I wrote, poetry and observations and kept a notebook that I wrote in, everywhere I went, and all of my secrets went there. I eventually developed friends who were close enough that I could begin to share some of these stories, some of these secrets. But yeah, it was the poetry, writing it out, that helped me to manage and to handle and to get it out of me, so I didn't feel like I was carrying this. I didn't have the weight of it because I was putting it somewhere. I was just putting it on the page. So.
And Grace?
So silence is such a part of the child sexual abuse experience itself. I think that it relies on silence to continue. And even when children speak up, there is, a pressure to be silent and tell a different story or make people think that that's not actually what happened. And so for me, silence is because it happened to me for so long, silence is a part of my personality in a way. And so it does reflect itself in my writing. And even though this memoir is about my life and it does cover the part of my life that I experienced child sexual abuse, I also, I don't really want to write so directly about it. I've read hundreds of incest memoirs, anything for years, anything that existed. And, you know, I saw like the different ways that people approach that material. And I had made a pretty definitive choice of like, I don't think I want to do some of that kind of writing. I just don't. But I also showed it to people I trusted, and they just didn't know what had happened to me. They're like, we actually don't even understand what we went through. So do you think you could write about it and not have that sort of silence or erasure happening there? Because I think it would be important. And so I did do a little bit of writing there, but I'm not a poet at all, but there's a little bit in the book that I use. It's not verse, but it's just like 7 sentences, one after the other, that are repeated. And I'm hoping that it works in terms of conveying the length of my experience. I'll just read 2 of the lines and then you can figure out the rest. But I write, this is what happened and happened and happened. I was 7 and he was 70. I was 8 and he was 71. And it goes on. And that's the way that I try to use the silence in between those lines to actually tell the story and not write it so explicitly.
And actually, sorry, real quick, before I go to Alicia, I was just thinking about it reminded me of this moment in your book, Grace, where my teacher asked if someone was hurting me, and also it reminds me a little bit of Sonia's book. And you have this meta like moment in the present tense where you say, even now I am discovering the extent of the injury. And I think that kind of like goes back and reminds me of that idea of breaking forms in order, or like chronology or structure in order to write about trauma. But that was I remember loving that moment. So sorry, Alicia.
So I guess 2 things. One thing is for anybody who's met me in real life, I am not a quiet person. Actually, someone introduced like an introduction for something I did the other day. They like went around and asked people like, what did they remember about me? And one of the things that was part of my introduction was like hearing me laugh like down the hallway. So I'm really not a quiet person. And I think that, I mean, a lot of that not quietness and a lot of the stuff I talk about in the book is, you know, a direct result of in defiance to, right, all the things that have asked me to be quiet throughout my life, to which, you know, I very loudly refuse, much to some people's dismay. And in terms of from like a craft perspective, I grew up reading books by people who did a lot of drugs and who were like really crazy. And when I was like 16 and 17, I thought that was like super cool. And like, that's what I needed. And I talk about this in the book. There's like I talk about this, but I thought that like that was part of being an artist, meant like I had to be tortured. And so I think for me, when I was writing this book, it was like, you know, a sort of push-pull between like, yeah, of course I want the language to be beautiful and I want it to be compelling and I want it to be interesting because I want the reader to enjoy it. But at the same time, like, I don't want to like glamorize or idealize this suffering in a way that like you need to have trauma to be an interesting person, you know, which is like totally what I thought when I was a teenager. Yeah.
Or people think this happens with trauma narratives too. I think where people think, oh, if you did, someone said this, I was telling Alicia, someone said it to me recently in an interview where it was, but you know, like if he hadn't raped you, you wouldn't really have a book, would you? I was like, I think I would have written about something else. You know, it's as if like, right, the trauma defines you and like you need that to happen to be a writer. Mm-hmm. And I really just like that assumption that some people make where, oh, because a writer writes about a traumatic event, it must mean they're just trying to make money, which, my God, do something else other than writing. But
there's not that much money in the world.
Right. And I mean, I don't want to focus on the negative. I don't mean to, focus on negative reception, but I think that happens a lot to writers, and especially writers who are not men, where there's this assumption you must have trauma, or the trauma makes you a writer if you've written about it. I'm curious. I mean, we're starting to get some audience questions, which is great. So I'm going to ask one more. I have so many questions, but I'm going to ask one more question and then pivot to audience questions. So please type more in the chat as they come to you. So the last question I'll ask is about ethical concerns when you were writing. Did any of those arise? And I think it's actually kind of tied up with this question about audience, of how much do you think about your audience when you write? But were there ethical concerns you were facing as writers, and how did you deal with those? Or did you not have any ethical concerns, that's fine too. Start with Grace.
Well, I guess, I mean, I would say no, but then I think that a part of me, I mean, I waited to publish a lot of the material, especially the ones that have to do with my grandfather, until he had died, until many of his children, my father's siblings, had died. So even if that wasn't an ethical consideration in terms of like, oh, is it okay to write about them? Because I do think it is okay for me to write about them. I think there must have been a part of me that held back and didn't feel comfortable until they had died. So I think in that case, yes. I think ethical concerns would arise, like if people are in a different position of power than me. Like I asked my nieces and nephews in Nibbling, I would show them like, oh, this is a line where I describe you, or I tell a story about us. And before I even wrote it, I made sure that it was something that I didn't have ethical concerns about, but because they're children, I wanted them to like consent to being written about. I know people don't have to do that, but I did, because I that was how I wanted to have my relationship with them. So
that's great. And Nikki?
My big issue, because when I saw this question, I thought I didn't have any concerns, and then I remembered, well, wait, there was my sister. Part of my story is also her story, and although we were separated for a lot of our childhood, so there are places, parts of my story that have nothing to do with her, but in those places that did, I wanted her to be aware and hopefully be okay with that I was putting this material out into the world. So I shared those parts of the story with her in advance because I did not want her to feel blindsided. In terms of the other people in the story, over the years, most of them have passed on, so it wasn't really an issue anyway. But I was concerned about her and the parts of the story that included her, where I was writing about her, because that is the single most important relationship I concern myself with, because we were in that hell together. So that mattered to me.
Thank you. And Sonia, and then Alicia?
Yeah, I think for me, so from the fiction side of things, I just had this tremendous feeling of responsibility around the topic, and, not wanting, it was definitely like a do no harm to, on the topic. And so I could get caught up in my head a little bit about that. Like I struggled a bit for a while with thinking, well, I don't want to contribute to, where people think because Tori's mom is a single mom and things like that. So the specifics of the story, I didn't want to contribute to, people, thinking that it only happens to in that case and things like that. But you have to be specific, right? I mean, that's how you get the reader into the story and how the story comes out. So yeah, I had to let a lot of that go, but I do feel like I ruminated over a lot of things like that a lot.
Just to sort of come at this question from a different perspective. So one of my concerns I had when I was writing this book was the notion of making a statement against psychiatric medication and psychiatric practices in general. And I tried really carefully to like not really sort of take a stand in either camp in my writing. And I interviewed a couple of different medical professionals in the process of writing this book, which, like, you know, there's so much that happens outside of the writing of the book that doesn't make it into the book, but is still necessary to write the book. So for me, a lot of it was just like looking into what medical practices actually are, especially like in contrast to how a patient experiences them, especially in contrast to like how the DSM got revised in between some stuff, you know. So yeah, for me, that was sort of one of the larger considerations, is how to you know, share my experience without sounding like I was, you know, damning all of psychiatry, which I am not.
No, and it doesn't come across like you are. So I want to pivot. There's so much but I'm not going to be selfish. I'm going to pivot to the audience. Let's see. All right, here's one. How did all of you manage to talk about the publishing of your stories or traumas to your families or loved ones who perhaps did not know or perhaps had no inkling about these stories? Sonia, I mean, yours is fiction, but I guess, is it, you know, when someone asks what you're working on, I don't know if already there was a concern about how do you talk about it. Maybe that could be part.
Yeah, I mean, I think it took me a while to just sort of process and figure out how to talk about it. And it was such a process that I don't know that I can pinpoint like any specific part of it, other than to say that it wasn't all at once. So yeah, definitely.
And then others, you know, how did you manage to talk about it to your families or loved ones while you were working on it?
I can go. I've been writing, and I need a lot of privacy when I write, and so I was just doing my thing for years and years in writing, and I would try to get things published, and they wouldn't get published, and so I didn't feel like I needed to tell my family. But once I knew that my memoir would be published, and I signed my book contract and all that, then that's when I got serious about talking to people in my life about what was in the memoir. And it wasn't because I was asking their permission and I would retract that from the book. It was just more like, I'm giving you a heads up, like, this is what I'm doing, just so that you're aware. And, you know, I was fully prepared that people would, you know, I had to like come to terms with it. Like, they could say, I never want to talk to you again. And I had to be ready for that. And I thought to myself, I'm like, I am. Like, if they don't want, like, if that's how they feel, like, that's really messed up. And I guess they're just not going to be in my life.
I didn't talk to too many people about it. For a couple of people. Of course, I already talked about my sister, but I also have a longtime friend who is an important figure in my story. And I talked with her about it, in part because I had questions. There were things that came to me that I wasn't clear about, and I thought she might be able to give me some clarity. She helped me actually to recover a memory in the midst of it, which was kind of cool. I was writing about my father's last gift to me before he died, which was a pair of ice skates. And I remember how emotional I felt about that gift, but I also, in writing about it, was wondering why he would give me ice skates, because I knew this was an expensive gift. And so I called my friend, and because I didn't remember ever skating. I loved ice skating. I always watch it whenever it's on. I watch the Olympics and, you know, just anything having to do with ice skating. I'm a huge spectator, and but I never questioned why I was connected to that sport. I thought it was beautiful, whatever. And I talked to her and I found out, and I said, Deb, did we ever go ice skating? Oh, sure. And then she launched into, like, for several minutes, memories of where we skated and, you know, parties, you know, with hot chocolate on the side and just different experiences of being out on the ice. And I was like, wow. And then over the next 48 hours, images started to come back to me. I started remembering. So apparently you don't only lose traumatic memories, you can lose good ones as well. And so I'm really glad I talked to her and asked questions here and there, because she helped to fill out the story for me.
That's amazing. And yeah, and Alicia?
My dad actually once told me, I don't remember who he was quoting, but he was quoting somebody, and he said that essentially they say that artists never make their best work until after their parents have died. And I was like, Dad, I think he's watching right now. So, you know, I think when I think about my book and just writing traumatic things in general, especially if they're nonfiction, it's very easy, I think, for a reader, like especially a casual reader. And by casual reader, I just mean like a reader who does not also write books, to sort of have this idea that, like, you know, this is the totality of your experience. And I think that one of the things that we do as nonfiction writers is, you know, we keep things for ourselves, right? Like there is still a sense of like boundaries and like, this is mine, I'm not going to talk about this. But you hopefully don't get that sensation when you're like reading the book that like I'm holding out on anything. Which is all to say, like, there's a ton of stuff that I didn't put in the book. But I think that for me, in terms of people around me, I think people were more surprised by the fact that I had been diagnosed bipolar disorder, because that was the thing I actually never talked about, was the fact that I was diagnosed with this really serious mental illness. All the other stuff, shenanigans that like actually happens, air quote, in the chapters, like I feel like that I was way more open about, but not the actual mental illness itself. So that's my experience.
Thank you. All right, so we have a lot of questions. So someone asked, how do you figure out, this is a really good question. How do you figure out how to start? What is the, like, do you make, they say, what is the outline of the book? Do you outline? Or how do you know how to tell the stories? So like, how do you start? Sonia, can I start with you?
Sure. So I'm not an initial outliner, at least. I've come to start to do it more with revision and now, but I'm definitely, like, as we term it, sometimes a pantser, in the sense that I'll often get some pivotal scenes. In the case of this book, it was the earliest scene, but it doesn't always have to be. So sometimes I'll get, the climax or something, and then I feel like I'm sort of writing towards it. But yeah, I don't think I always know. In this case I did, but I don't always know what the beginning's going to be. And often that changes in revision. So there's a lot of sifting. And I'm also someone who starts with the bones and then keeps adding and layering. So that's my process.
I usually start off with a skeletal outline. I didn't do that in the case of this story because I was too close to it. But the other thing that happens is that this is a story that evolved. What I did nail down were the parameters of the story, because when you talk about, memoir or autobiography, you have to pick and choose. Okay, well, what's going to be the scope of it? Because I'm not going to write about my entire life. What in it, what's going to be the through line, and what am I going to focus on? And initially, I was going to focus on the 16th year of my life, because that year was just so incredibly pivotal to who I am, who I became. But then when I started writing, I realized if I don't start from the beginning, that the 16th year doesn't really make sense without the 15 years that led up to it. And so then I went all the way back. But I didn't initially plan on doing that. But I knew that those were my bookends, the beginning and that 16th year, and that the story would end there.
Great. And Grace, how do you start?
I start with, especially with memoir, I start with images, bits of dialogue, moments, memories, and I collect them. I mean, once I start to think of one, then I feel like it's like a train, like there's more behind them as soon as I start to remember some. And I keep track of them, and then I'll take one of those bits and put a timer on and start writing about it. And maybe 10 minutes or 30 minutes or 6 minutes. And then I'll accumulate all those things, and then I can start to put things together. Because I've always wanted to write a book because I've loved books so much, and I thought that you write a book the way that the book looks, like the way, like you start with, this is like the first line that you write is the first line of the book. And now that I've gone through the experience, it's like, no, that's not, I don't, at least that's not how I work. And I say that because I think sometimes people stop writing because the thing that they're writing doesn't seem like a book. But I think if you can like accumulate a bunch of stuff and write a bunch of stuff, then you have the material that you might be able to put together and have something cohere.
That's what I call approaching it like a jigsaw puzzle. I approach all my work that way. I focus on the pieces. I don't worry about what the order is going to be. That can come later. But just I work on the individual pieces. And then as I have X number of pieces, I'll start to see how they fit together. And then I'll work on some more pieces.
That's great. I like that.
That way.
That's kind of how I approached this as well. My first draft, it's very generous to call it a draft, it was like a bubble map. So like, in the middle, I wrote like misdiagnosis with a big circle around it. And then I had like a bunch of lines going off of it and a bunch of other bubbles. And I just thought about like, all right, what are the different things that like went into this process? And those eventually became essays. So like there'd be one where that was like food, right? And then I'd like write the rice grain girl chapter and cross out that bubble. And it was sort of a process of bubbles. And then once at a certain point, I had run out of bubbles, and yeah. And then the jigsaw puzzle, I really like that analogy actually, sort of like piecing together, like, okay, what's still missing? What do we need to fill in? Where does this go? Where does that go? And because I knew I was writing an essay collection, I felt like I had a little bit more freedom with like keeping things discreet. I think my big challenge was like making sure I wasn't repeating too much information across the essays, and like keeping people bound in their appropriate essays when they, easily could have sprawled across all of them.
And another question here. This is a good question. How do you write about trauma that you have not fully healed from yet? Is being healed essential to beginning the writing process, or is the writing part of the healing journey?
I have a lot of opinions on this, so I'm happy to go
first. Okay, come on in.
And please, like, I hope that you all will tell me if you think I am super wrong, because I welcome that. But I was in a class the other day, and I forget what the exact question was, but it was something like, how did you start writing this book? But it was like it was phrased more broadly, like something about my life. And like, I don't know, I really think that to write nonfiction, like you have to, I think Grace was talking about it, like you have to have your stuff figured out to some extent before you can put it on the page. A lot of times, I think, especially with nonfiction, especially if you've been in a workshop setting, you've like read an essay, and I've had this experience, I'll speak with from the eye, but I'm like, I don't know how to give good feedback right now, because to me, it's not a craft issue, it's like a thinking issue. It's like the way this piece is being conceptualized. There's like some fundamentally flawed thinking. And that's not what you talk about in workshop, right? Like workshop is about the craft. So for me, like it was really important that like I had at least a basic handle on some of this stuff, which is not to say that like writing the book was easy, or there were not some parts that were incredibly difficult and required more processing and things of that nature. But ultimately for me, like, I don't think I could write about something unless, how did I put it the other day? It's like writing is therapeutic, but it's not therapy, right? And so like trying to figure out the balance between those, because also for me, like, I'm not gonna workshop something if like, someone's like, well, why did this character do, like, can you maybe have a bit more exposition here so we can understand the character's motivation? And I start sobbing hysterically, like that's not gonna be productive for anybody. So that's my very strong opinions on that. I don't know if you all, I'd love to hear your other people think.
No, I absolutely agree with that, that you need to have things worked out. I mean, it's not going to be useful for the reader or helpful in any way if I'm still trying to, sort through it, which isn't to say I don't discover some things, which is one of the wonderful things about writing is the discovery that happens, where you teach yourself something just in the process of, committing it to the page. But yeah, because people were asking, how did you write this? And, wasn't it hard? And I was like, well, I already worked on this stuff. That's why I can write about it for you, in this format. Now, along the way, I'm writing about it in poems, just for myself, again, in that survival mode. That's not something I'm sharing with people. And there, it doesn't matter whether or not I've worked it out, because I'm still in the process of working it out. But when I get to create the work that I'm going to share with the reading public, yeah, I want to have that. I want to know already that I've been healed and I have a really good handle on it, and am objective enough to be able to handle emotional dynamite in a way that is responsible. That's what you're doing.
And he brings up a good point about writing for yourself versus writing for the public. And I think that there's a lot of ways that writing for yourself can be therapeutic and be part of like the healing process or journey. And I can discover things through the practice of writing, but that would never be anything I showed anybody or expected to have an audience for. It really is just for me. And, Jeannie had read that line about like me through the process of writing and editing this book, discovering ways that I was still damaged or ways that I'd been impacted still. And that's also true. It's like I still, I think I have a handle on a lot of things, but I think there are ways that I don't. And there's going to be like layers left. When I gave my first reading for the book, someone in the audience asked, now that you published the book, are you healed? And I was like, I wish, if that could happen, like you could do something like that and then be healed from whatever it was you were going through, it would be amazing. But I don't think so. I mean, I'm definitely better off than I was years ago. I don't really even know what healed means in this kind of situation.
And Sonia, I don't know if you want to, you wrote fiction, but I don't know if you want to come at this question.
Well, I think what everyone said really rang true. And I think that there is an aspect of responsibility and what's going to be conveyed that it's very helpful to be along the road, at least in healing, I think, in order to convey that in the best way. Yeah.
Great. Okay. So, and actually, Sonia, there's one question specific to you, and then I think we can wrap up. And I might actually expand this question and ask everyone, like, is there something you're reading now that you're really excited about? So the question for Sonia was, it says, Sonia mentioned picture books that influenced her writing a middle grade book about trauma. What were they and how did they help?
Oh, I realized I didn't make the connection there. I said that earlier. So it wasn't that it was a specific picture book in that case. What it was is that I had only really done prose before that. And so for me, that was what got me into verse, because the picture book is so focused on word choice and on rhythm and on just, all kinds of things, repetition. And so that somehow I was in that mode. And so that when the character's voice came to me, then that is why. So yeah, it wasn't a particular book in that case though, but yeah.
And does anyone, do any of you want to plug other writers' work, something you're excited about right now that you're reading?
Yeah, there's what's her name? Alysia Sasha. Her book, My Body is a Book of Rules, I think is like, I hate the term comp, but like I think it would be a comp for mine. But she has a new book coming out next year.
White Magic, yes.
Which I'm super excited for. And I have heard a rumor that the epigraph is a Twin Peaks quote. So I am really excited for that.
I just grabbed the closest book to me. This is Don't Ask Me Where I'm From by Jennifer De Leon. And it follows a high school student, Liliana, as she makes her way in the world in a area of Boston. She gets bused to a more affluent school, and it's about her life.
My list is too long, and I'm always afraid I'm going to leave somebody out, so I'm not going.
Do you want to mention to everyone your book? You have another book that recently came out on Kamala Harris. Do you want to?
Oh, yes, that little book. Yes, I have a picture book biography of Kamala Harris titled Kamala Harris, Rooted in Justice. And no, I didn't know in advance that she'd end up being the VP. People think I have like some sort of magic thing going. I wish I did. But yeah, I was quite excited when it was announced. I thought, I might be able to actually renovate another room now. It's a good deal. And in researching her story, discovered that we share a birthday. So there's that. It was good.
Happy birthday then, very recently, right? Wasn't it just her birthday?
Yeah, Tuesday. 70, the big 7-0. I'm officially an old codger.
And Sonia, are there any books you want to?
Yeah, so a fellow debut author's book. It's a YA called Agnes at the End of the World by Kelly McWilliams. I just love it because, well, I should say first, it's about, it actually has a pandemic in it. And it was written before, the pandemic. And then it came out during the pandemic, which was interesting for her. But it is also about these two sisters who are escaping from a religious cult that they're in. And so it has this amazing mix of action and character and all of that happening at once in a way that I think is really hard to do. So.
That's great. Well, thank you all so much, and thank you everyone out there in the other dimensions for attending and being here. We really appreciate it.